Top boxing news. Ow!
Okay, we'll start with this. Well, there was some movement, some activity at 122 pounds. Sigolene Lefebvre of France took on Paulette Valenzuela of Mexico for what was the vacant WBO Super Bantamweight title. And as I predicted, as I expected, Sigolene Lefebvre is the newly crowned WBO Super Bantamweight champion. Just like that, in the same calendar year, France might have lost the blue belt at 130 pounds, but they've gained the pink one at 122 pounds.
Sigolene is this division's WBO champion.
Alongside reigning WBA champion Mayerlin Rivas, reigning WBC champion Yamileth Mercado.
Argentina's own Daniela Bermuda is holding the IBF.
No word on when she will return, as she has been with child. Better still, for the time being, there are 4 active reigning world champions in the Super Bantamweight division. 4 world titleists. That being said, this is a division that needs consolidation. Because Sigolene Lefebvre is an MTK global fighter, it's conceivable that she might be the one that unifies titles with one or some of the other champions that are out there because she's got major management behind her. We all know about MTK's pull. We all know they've got the juice and they can make things happen. Sigolene could be the one that brings consolidation to this weight class over time, perhaps not straight away. I'm sure she'll have 1 or 2 defenses before she is so confronted with another world champion like herself. But it might very well be Sigolene that brings consolidation to this division because she, unlike the other 3 champions, has major backing. Sigolene may be the game changer that this division needs to see it some point perhaps crowning an undisputed champion. Though before it comes to that, Sigolene Lefebvre may see herself facing her mandatory challenger, because also in action this weekend, Marcela Acuña of Argentina and Deborah Dionicius, they locked horns in their native Argentina at Luna Park for what was the WBO interim title at this same weight. And Deborah Dionicius, she upset the apple cart for the Argentinian legend. She got herself back in the winner's bracket and became the WBO's interim champion. So going into the year of 2022, we could see Sigolene Lefebvre defending her newly obtained WBO title against her mandatory challenger, Deborah Dionicius.
Yeah, we might see that before we see a unification match.
It would be a credible scalp for newly crowned WBO Super Bantamweight champion Sigolene Lefebvre. The most credible scalp on her resume so far, even more credible than the scalp of Paulette Valenzuela, who she just beat this past weekend for that vacant title. So I'm looking forward to that fight if and when it comes into fruition. In other news, the world is still reacting to this past weekend's welterweight contest between Terence Crawford, the champion, and Shawn Porter, the challenger. An account that goes by the name of Dead Game Boxing asked the question, did Shawn Porter expose weaknesses in Terence Crawford's game? To which I replied, the punch stats say Errol got touched by Shawn 172 times. That was 172 connects for Shawn Porter in that Errol Spence Jr. fight. That was actually the most times that Errol Spence Jr. had been hit in a boxing match thus far. Crawford only got touched 79 times. Less than half the punches landed on Errol. Errol is the one that gets hit too much, to which Dead Game Boxing replied, because Errol signed up for a toe-to-toe shootout. He wanted to show that he could stand toe-to-toe with Porter and beat him at his own game. Crawford fought a technical fight and would have been a boring victory if Porter didn't step on the gas, and I really don't know what point Dead Game Boxing was trying to make.
Wasn't he just trying to say that Shawn Porter exposed holes in Terence Crawford's game?
By landing less punches on Crawford than he did on Spence.
It's Terence Crawford that got exposed, not Errol Spence.
Even though Shawn Porter connected on Errol twice as much, more than twice as much, than he did on Crawford. I replied by saying, in any event, it took Crawford less than half the punches to inflict damage, enough that Kenny thought it prudent to pull Shawn out. 98 punches landed to Errol, who landed 221 punches on Shawn. No towel, no stoppage. Seems to me Errol's plan for Shawn wasn't a very good one, and he does in fact get hit more often than Crawford. That's what the punch stats show, and You can forget about the punch stats. You can watch the goddamn fight and see that Sean landed more punches on Errol than he did on Crawford.
Been seeing a lot of this as of late.
Fight fans out there trying to shade Terence Crawford's victory because Terence Crawford did prove to be a lot more efficient.
More efficient than Errol Spence.
He didn't acquiesce to fighting Sean Porter's kind of fight the way that Errol Spence Jr. did. Terence Crawford...
He didn't allow Sean Porter to turn it into a brawl.
These statistics aren't being received well in some quarters, and there are those out there that are working hard, working vigorously to try to explain them away. You know, upon posting the punch stats for both of those respective fights, one guy that goes by the name of Kenny Price stated, if you do a simple ratio, you'll see, based on the punches landed, Porter landed on Crawford a tenth of the time more often than he did against Spence in a more economical fight from a punch output standpoint.
So does that mean Sean hit Terence as many times as he hit Errol?
No. Errol Spence absorbed 172 shots from Sean Porter, whereas Crawford only absorbed 79.
So then what the hell is this guy talking about?
Seems to me that what Kenny Price was trying to do was misrepresent the answer to what is a very simple question. Who did Sean Porter land more punches on? He landed more punches on Errol Spence Jr. He added, you're being dishonest with the numbers. Punch totals from each fight reflect the type of fight it was. Spence was more voluminous with punches. The Crawford fight was more economical. It's simple, man. One fight was more checkers, the others was more chess.
What part of those numbers is the dishonest part?
Is Kenny Price saying that Sean Porter didn't land as many punches on Errol as he did on Crawford? Is that what he's saying? Or is he trying to misrepresent the answer because he doesn't like what it is? That Errol Spence Jr. did get hit a lot more than Terence Crawford did.
It's a fucking fact.
Been seeing a lot of this since Saturday. A lot of cockamamie arguments, a lot of deflecting, mental gymnastics. I mean, these guys deserve a gold medal.
Because it sounds a lot like this guy's trying to convince me getting hit 172 times is less than getting hit 79 times.
What year is this? What planet are we on to where getting hit 172 times is less than getting hit 79 times? See, the reason you're seeing what you're seeing, you're hearing what you're hearing, and you're reading what you're reading is because these guys don't like how this reflects on Errol Spence Jr.'s.
Crawford upstaged it.
Because Terence Crawford didn't simply acquiesce to fighting Sean Porter's kind of fight the way that Errol Spence Jr. did. Errol Spence Jr., who I've long stated, is a flat-footed fighter. He's not as light on his feet as Terence Crawford. He can't pivot and shift, then hook on the turn and/or uppercut.
He wasn't able to bull in Matador Sean the way Bud did.
And that's why his fight looked the way that it looked with Sean Porter, and that's why Crawford's fight looked the way that it looked with that same Sean Porter. One of these guys is more fleet of foot because one of these guys has better feet than the other. Errol Spence Jr. wasn't able to keep Sean Porter out of the pocket because he doesn't have the feet to maneuver around him.
So he was there for the exchanges.
In layman's terms, he was there to be hit. Now, there are those out there that would have me and you believe that this was a deliberate attempt on Errol Spence Jr.'s part to try and beat Sean Porter at his own game. And even if it was, it's still a haphazard strategy.
Your plan is to get hit more than you have to.
This is your plan of action, to take more punishment than is necessary. Or is it that the only reason Sean Porter hit you so much is because you couldn't keep him out and you couldn't get away from him?
Well, that makes a lot more sense than standing there getting punched in the face when you don't have to.
Not if you have a choice, but that's just it. Sean didn't leave Errol with much of a choice because Errol couldn't keep him out and he didn't have the feet to outmaneuver him, to get away from him. The kind of feet that Terence Crawford has, pivoting and shifting on the turn as Sean Porter lunged in.
I've got a lot of time for anecdotes from fanboys.
Not when Sean Porter himself was quoted as saying post-fight, it felt like the fight with Errol Spence, going 12 rounds, was not as tough as fighting Terence Crawford. And that quote from Sean Porter himself, the now retired two-time welterweight champion, will be much to the chagrin of Errol Spence Jr.'s fans.
I don't want to hear that.
It's bad enough that Errol Spence Jr. has sat out all of this year, hasn't had a fight in the last 11 months, going on 12. It's bad enough that one of his career best wins,
a guy that he said he was going to knock out,
but couldn't, after landing a sum total of 221 punches. It's bad enough that Errol Spence Jr., he couldn't knock Sean Porter out. He couldn't force a stoppage. Nothing. But Terence Crawford, he did, whilst being more efficient, more economic, more cerebral, and overall better than Errol Spence Jr.
because he is better than Errol Spence Jr.
Do you think that a blown-up lightweight with no experience in the welterweight division who's not throwing any punches would go the distance with Terence Crawford? Do you think Mikey Garcia would go 12 rounds with Terence Crawford?
No.
Errol Spence Jr. landed over 300 punches on Mikey Garcia. Mikey who wasn't fighting him off or fighting back. And Errol couldn't score a knockout. He couldn't score so much as a knockdown much less a knockout. On a guy he landed 300 punches, over 300 punches on. He landed 221 punches on Sean Porter, significantly more punches than Terence Crawford did. Crawford only landed 98 punches on Sean Porter. That's less than half the punches that Errol Spence Jr. landed, but Crawford, he actually forced a stoppage. Spence didn't. It's because of what I've been telling you all along. Spence power ain't what they say it is, and Spence ain't.
Errol ain't who they say he is.
What they say he is. The writing's been on the wall. These guys, they just don't want to read it. And when the writing is so clearly on the wall about a fighter, it's boxing illiteracy is what it is. To be in denial about how Errol Spence Jr. stacks up Terence Crawford.
He doesn't.
In other news, I'm sure most of you have heard by now that Dimitri Bivol's next fight is all set and primed to go. He's going to be taking on Umar Salamov. That's the same Umar Salamov that was supposed to be fighting Joe Smith Jr., but did not get the chance to since he wasn't approved for a travel visa from Russia to America. Thus, his very next fight is going to be in Russia, and he is getting a title shot, just not at the title we thought he would. Instead of the WBO title, he's going to be fighting for the WBA title.
And that's fine.
A few weeks ago, there were reports that it was Eddie Hearn's intention to match Dimitri Bivol against John Ryder. John Ryder, who would be moving up from super middleweight up to light heavyweight to help keep Dimitri Bivol busy. And comparatively, I do think this is a better fight, and a fight that Dimitri won't face as much criticism for. Dimitri, he's in the hot seat right now. A lot of people, they want to see him in a big fight. And if he ends up fighting a guy like John Ryder, there's room to levy criticism against him, given what other options are out there. Umar Salamov is a full-fledged light heavyweight and a more credible scalp in that division than John Ryder would have been.
So it's an arguably better fight.
Now, why is Dimitri Bivol's next fight in Russia as opposed to the United Kingdom or the United States? Why is he participating as part of a Titov RCC boxing promotion as opposed to a matchroom promotion? Your guess is as good as mine. Maybe he didn't feel like traveling. Though given that this doesn't look like it's a Matchroom show, I don't get the sense you're going to see this as part of your DAZN subscription. The saving grace is that RCC has a channel here on YouTube, and they often show fights free of charge from that region of the world. So I do get the sense we'll still be able to see the fights, but it won't be part of our DAZN subscriptions. Also on this card, a fight that I talked about in my previous video, Patrick Tesheira versus Kurbanoff, junior middleweight contest that has all the makings of a real Donnybrook, real dust-up, real slobber-knocker, because these are two guys that like to punch. Between the co-main and the main, between the main event and its chief support, this is actually a decent card worth a watch. Patrick Tesheira is a more experienced guy than Magomed Kurbanoff. Magomed Kurbanoff, who won a very controversial decision win over the United Kingdom's own Liam Beefy Smith. A lot of people that saw that fight felt that Beefy had done enough to win the fight, but they gave Magomed the decision. Magomed, who's facing Patrick Tesheira in his very next fight. Patrick, who's coming right off that loss to Argentinia's own Brian Castano. And, you know, comparatively, Patrick's been in there with better guys. Win, lose, or draw. He's been in there with Brian Castano, Carlos Adames, Patrick Galati, Nathaniel Gilmore, Curtis Stevens. I'd keep an eye on the winner of this fight because I get the sense that the winner of this fight may see themselves so confronted with Australia's Tim Tszyu. That's right. Tim's not going straight into that world title fight, getting that title shot at Brian Castano, because Brian's about to have a rematch with Jermel Charlo.
So maybe Tim can fight the winner of this fight.
Finally, per tweet from Michael Benson, Frank Warren says, Tyson Fury will be back in the ring by late February or early March. Due to the legal wranglings involving Dillian Whyte, Tyson does not have a mandatory call to answer and is free to proceed with a defense of his belt, and it's a fight I'd like to stage in the UK. And I'm not at all surprised to see that Tyson Fury...
Sounds like he's going to be taking in a voluntary.
You know, we've been talking about this a lot the last couple of days, last couple of weeks here on the channel. Whether or not Dillian Whyte shot himself in the foot by seeking legal action, legal counsel for the title shot that he never got by way of the WBC, has that move since backfired? And in truth, I don't know that I totally believe that, because it seems to me the WBC has been determined to keep him away from the green belt.
Seems to me no matter what happened, they weren't going to let him fight for it.
And this is just their latest reason, their latest excuse. He sought legal counsel for a title shot that you haven't given him yet. So you can remedy the situation by giving him the shot.
Hey, wouldn't that wrap all of this up?
It's a legitimate question. ultimately, even with the cancellation of White versus Valine, I was never confident that White versus Fury would come into fruition. I was never confident that they'd get the fight over the line. Underneath it all, I felt that Tyson Fury, through some method, through some means, would find a way out, or the WBC would assist him in finding a way out. And it appears that they have, because this legal situation is all about a title shot that Dillian hasn't been given. So why don't you just give him the shot?
Looks like Tyson might end up fighting Joe Joyce.
Joe Joyce has gone on record saying that he wants to fight Tyson Fury before Dillian White does. And given that both he and Tyson, they're Frank Warren's boys over there in the United Kingdom, it is possible that they get that fight over the line. I don't think Joe's earned a title shot as much as Dillian has, though overall, it is an intriguing fight between Joe, smoking Joe Juggernaut Joyce, and Tyson Fury. As an American, I do wonder how the Brits feel about this and how they would receive such a fight if it were announced. If it were announced that Tyson Fury, instead of fighting Dillian White, he's going to be fighting Joe Joyce instead. Would that fight garner the same kind of enthusiasm, the same kind of excitement that a Dillian White fight would garner? Because Dillian White is more or less a more established name than Joe Joyce is over there.
He's a marquee guy.
Would it be viewed as an equally intriguing night of boxing between Joe Joyce and Tyson Fury, or would Joe be interpreted as lesser than a Dillian fight? I know for Frank Warren it creates a much easier situation than dealing with Dillian White. Dillian White likely would want big money for a Tyson Fury fight, as a Tyson Fury fight with him would be a big fight in the United Kingdom. Joe Joyce is a much cheaper alternative that allows Frank to circumvent that circumstance. It don't cost as much to pay Joe as it would to pay Dillian. So Frank, old fish eyes, he'd save himself a headache and a few million for not having to pay Dillian White the way he'd want to get paid for this fight.
Because he'd want to get paid for this fight.
You have to wonder if Dillian shouldn't just abandon this campaign altogether, because it's been going on for years, and it seems a lot like he's going to go the rest of his entire career having not been able to fight for the green belt, having not been able to fight for the WBC title. Should he just cut his losses and see about fighting for a different title?